Have you ever heard someone say race is a social construct? Maybe you read it in an article, or maybe it's just something your quirky activist friend keeps trying to explain to you. But the idea still doesn't really make sense? That's because most of us think about race as something that's fixed or unchangeable.
We are who we are, and we can't change that. Unless... Okay, but we won't go there. Racial categorizations are not quite as set as you may think.
At least historically, the way that different groups of people have been labeled for their race has changed many times.
U.S. Mexican history is a good example of that. So, let's start there.
About 15 years after the United States gained its independence in 1776, the government began to draw clear lines for who could become a legal citizen of the new nation and who could not. Their ideas became the law with the Naturalization Act of 1790,
which stated that only free white persons could be naturalized.
This excluded Native Americans, indentured servants, slaves, free African Americans, and Asians. This rule was upheld until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which laid claim to nearly half of the Mexican nation as it was. Oh yeah, did you know that this is how big Mexico used to be before the Mexican-American War? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo added approximately 525,000 square miles to United States territory. So, the U.S. government was faced with an important question. What would become of the nearly 200,000 people that were living in what used to be Mexican territory? Were they Mexican? Were they American? Ultimately, the government decided to grant Mexicans the right to U.S. citizenship. This was important because it implied a white legal status for Mexican Americans that no other ethnic group had been given before. In fact, to compare to the status of African Americans, it was at this exact time that the one-drop rule came into being. This rule stated that one drop of black ancestry made someone black, regardless of what they looked like, where they came from, or who their parents were. But for Mexican Americans, the opposite was happening. There was a kind of unofficial reverse one-drop rule, which said that one drop of Spanish blood made a person white. Pretty contradictory, huh? This contradiction didn't really get challenged until a legal case called Henry Rodriguez in 1897, when a man named Ricardo Rodriguez, who was born in Mexico, applied to become a citizen of the United States. In the end, the Texas federal court ruled that despite being lamentably ignorant and copper-colored, they would grant Rodriguez citizenship based on the fact that he seemed peaceable and industrious. Peaceable and industrious? If those were the only two criteria for becoming a citizen, then wouldn't all slaves have qualified for citizenship 200 years before then? The truth is, the judge's decision to accept Ricardo Rodriguez likely had nothing to do with his personality, and everything to do with the fact that the United States was experiencing a shortage in labor and needed Mexican immigrants. Ever since the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, Chinese immigrants who had been coming to the U.S. to work in the railroad and mining industries were no longer allowed to come or remain in the United States. So when that flow of cheap labor was cut off, those industries needed to find other workers, which is why they looked to Mexico. The logic behind Rodriguez was that Mexicans were white enough, despite not truly being white, to become U.S. citizens. That is, because the United States had an economic purpose for them. This all changed during the Great Depression, however. With few jobs available, economic competition between whites and Mexicans became tense during the 1930s. A distinct anti-Mexican racism developed, and some 400,000 people of Mexican origin were rounded up by the police and deported. Before 1920, Mexican Americans were never considered a separate group in the national census. They had always been counted in the white category. However, during the Great Depression, Mexicans lost their white equivalency, and suddenly Mexican became a separate racial category altogether. So, you can see how the racial identity of Mexicans in United States history has changed several times, not based on where they came from or their ancestral lineage, but rather on the economic needs of the time. In other words, Mexican Americans were legally white when they were needed, and racially Mexican when they weren't.
So, when people talk about race as something that's made up by society, it's not to deny the fact that there are true differences between people, but rather to acknowledge that physical appearance, nationality, and immigration status are only a small part of the guidelines that our society uses to define a person's race.